Game design documents, there is no one set way of how to do these. I know that's really frustrating. I know you want someone to go do this, then do this, then do this. The approach I want to show you today is a very minimalistic approach, and it works around a general principle of giving a rough description of every area of the game that you can think of so that you can check that they all work together. Because one of the issues that we have, if you're a solo developer or an indie working in a small team, you will have biases towards focusing on particular things, right? If you're a story person, you'll get to the story bit of your document and then you'll kind of go into a weird fugue state, write 1,000,000 words, and then wake up the next day and you've basically written The Lord of the Rings. And then meanwhile, you haven't thought about level design, you haven't thought about how your game will be monetized, you haven't thought about the art style, but you've spent 1,000,000 pages making this narrative Bible. I don't want you to take that approach. I want you to have a list of areas of the game that need to be thought about, and then to describe your initial thinking in as few words as possible, and try and make it multimedia, use diagrams, use images, make it interesting for someone else to look at, because that's a downfall of big game design documents, is you spend ages pouring all of this thought and time into a thing and then no one else wants to look at it, because we're all programmers and artists with, you know, various different kind of neurological types, and we don't want to read a massive document when we could be making things pretty colors or programming explosions, right? So you need to respect your team or just your future version of yourself, whoever this is for, by making sure that this document isn't bigger than it needs to be and is focused on what it's trying to achieve. And what it's trying to achieve is saying, here's what we want to make. Is that a good idea? Right? You shouldn't go into any kind of design with the foregone conclusion that what you're making is good, because design is an iterative process, and it is a process of co-creation between the designer and the audience, or in this case, the gamers. This approach, this minimalistic approach to game design documents, is meant to take you as quickly as possible to having a prototype of a game that you can describe and talk about very well and playtest with people, and then just to map out the areas of the game where you might need to think about the longer term plan of like, what are all the levels, what are all the systems, what is all the content in this game, without deep diving too far into the details of those things up front, because otherwise you spend weeks and weeks writing this thing, and then 90% of that writing will be irrelevant later on when your game either dramatically changes or gets canned and never gets finished. So please bear all of that in mind. I know people are going to jump up in the comments and go, you left this out, you left that out. This is just about having a brief think about all of the different elements so that you can see if they make sense together, and make sure that you've thought about them all at least a little bit. So the game I'm going to be documenting today is called Prophecy. I'm sure there's already a game called that. If you can think of a better name for this game as I describe it, please let me know. Prophecy is a top-down multiplayer simulation game where each player represents a prophet, followed by a growing swarm of followers. Their goal is to traverse a procedurally generated world, converting followers, conquering foes, obtaining resources, and surviving for as long as possible. The game blends some elements of traditional God games like Populous and Black and White with a simplified battle royale model similar to Agario. This is the thing that your game design document, or any document, should start with: the broadest description of the game. Now there's some writerly issues here. I've reused the word followers, growing swarm of followers, converting followers. That should be converting non-believers, maybe. This describes the idea for the game, but there's no there's no superlatives here. There's no, it will be the best, it will be the most wonderful, it will be the most fantastic. It's just describing the game and trying to describe what's unique about it. And do not be afraid to make references to other games. I know that this kind of elevator pitch format of saying it's this thing plus this thing can feel a bit cheesy, but it can also be a really helpful way to explain your game idea to someone else. And that's why I've also got these images here. So if someone can't remember what agar.io is, there's an image of it there. And before we move on to our second section, I want to introduce another general principle of all documentation, and that is that you always start with the broadest part possible, the most you always start with the most broad and general thing possible, and then after that move into things that are more specific. So if you've got anything in your game that's specific, like talking about a specific piece of content, like a specific level or a specific character or a specific weapon, whatever your game has as content, that should never be what you start with. You should always start with the most general thing. Now, the type of game you're making is going to determine some of this stuff, because if we're making a very narrative driven game about a character, then we might want to talk about the character early on. But if your game is primarily a game about gameplay and things like characters and locations are secondary to that, then they shouldn't be up the top of the document. The start of the document needs to tell us what the player is doing. Now, one of the things I like to introduce early on is design pillars. Game design pillars are there to help guide a project so that it stays on track and is moving towards a specific type of experience. So if you think of, pillars as a metaphor, it's like what things are holding up this project, what things are central to the success of this as a product. Now, some people will put just like the genre here. They might put like the art style here. Those things are not necessarily design pillars. What design pillars are supposed to help us do is focus on the experience that the user or the audience is getting. So I've put here, we use design pillars to focus our design choices as we move through the project. For the purpose of this project, we want our design pillars to identify the types of fun or enjoyment which are key to the user experience. So I've actually put an explanation within the document of why I'm doing this. And that means that if I give this game design document to a programmer or a artist, they're not just going to see the pillars and go, oh, whatever, don't care about that game designer nonsense. And one of the things I would advise you do is use this framework called the 14 Forms of Fun. This is a really helpful tool, especially if you're working in a team, because fun is too much of a sort of vague word. It's a moving target. It means different things to different people. This list is a really good way to pick out things to put in your pillars. Now, I would usually miss a few off here, like beauty. Well, everyone kind of wants their game to be visually appealing in some way, even if it's most supposed to look kind of goofy and childlike. Beauty is still a goal of most video games, so I would leave that one out because it's redundant. But you can start to look through this list and pick out the 3 things that you think are the most important. For this document is power, competition, and problem solving, and the sections underneath this in the table explain why, and also sort of hint at how these things link into each other and reinforce each other. So under power, I've got satisfaction will come from players seeing their flock grow larger and larger as gameplay progresses. Your player character, your empire, whatever it is, gets stronger. That's a central part of lots of types of games, of RTSs, RPGs, lots of different genres. There's a competitive element. The game is online. It's in the same format as Agario, so we've got that competitive genre blueprint already there for us. And players are constantly under threat from the followers of the other player characters. They need to seek out the least occupied areas of the world and compete for resources to grow their flock and be able to fight. So you're constantly moving around. If you're strong, you're hunting down the weak. If you're weak, you're trying to get away from stronger characters and find resources elsewhere. So you've got that mix of kind of a battle royale with a very, very light 4X game. And then the last section is problem solving. Some elements of resource management and selection of appropriate upgrades will give players opportunities to feel satisfyingly clever. It's what you're doing every time you give players like an upgrade tree and you say, do you want this next or this next? You're giving them a intellectual problem to solve where they can look ahead strategically and say, well, if I get this now, I can get this upgrade later, and they compound and do this thing. Notice I'm not going into loads of detail about what any of these things are yet. I'm just saying how these main types of experience exist in the game and how they link together, right? You can see that the problem solving element of picking upgrades is going to feed into the sense of power that the player has and make them more competitive. So these things are all linked together here. They don't have to be, but doing this exercise is helping me to think through the mechanics and systems that I want in this game and understand how they work together. Next section, I've got audience and market. lots of people on game dev YouTube at the moment, I've noticed, are doing this thing where you conflate marketing with advertising. Now, advertising is obviously a big part of marketing. I'm not going to deny that, but marketing is much broader than that. If you think of a traditional market where someone goes and yells and says, "Buy my bananas," marketing is everything to do with how that business person operates in that market. It's what they're selling. It's the way they're talking to people, the way they're addressing people when they try and sell it. It's how they look. It's even what market they go to in the first place. And one of the reasons why so many smaller games fail is you just make what you want to make and you don't think about who this is for or where you're going to sell it. You make, you know, a game that is the wrong genre for the platform. You make a casual mobile style game and try and sell it on Steam. You make a very hardcore game and try and sell it on the App Store, whatever. Work out who your audience is. Put it early in your GDD, because everything else about your design will rotate around that. And this is obvious if you're making something like a free-to-play game with loot boxes in, right? That your game design would be revolving around that business model, that monetization model. But it's true of every genre on every platform, that you have to fit what you're making to where you are eventually going to try and sell it. So here, again, it's very light, very minimalistic. I've just put, the game is designed to be played online with other players via Steam. A single player casual mode without the competitive element will also be made available. And here's the important bit. Never design something that is for everyone, right? Because it doesn't work. The thing that you're making has to be for someone. And if you can't work out who it's for, work out who it's not for. And from there, you will start to work out who your audience is. So I've put here, for example, the game will contain some irreverent humor about religion, right? So it's going to annoy people that don't like things where religion is presented as something silly or bad, right? So I'm already excluding people in my marketing by designing this game, and I'm acknowledging that from the get-go, right? It will also contain some brutal slapstick violence. It'll be aimed at a teen to adult audience. So the religious theme, the violence, the kind of irreverence that this game has to that subject matter is going to exclude some people, and it's going to make the game feel like it's not appropriate for small children. All of these things are part of my audience and marketing section, and they need to be in there from the get-go because it helps to set the tone for what we're making. You know, how much blood is there going to be in this game? What kind of sound effects will there be? All of that stuff comes out of these considerations. Now, biggest section so far, and it should be, core gameplay. What is actually happening when a player plays this game? The player maneuvers their profit around the game world by using the WASD controls, then uses point and click mouse commands to give orders to the followers in the flock. Followers start out as neutral peasants who can be developed into different follower types, each having different behaviors and simple AI. I've listed them now, right? A good thing to learn about documentation is when and how to use bullet points. You should only really have bullet points if you have a lead-in sentence saying why there is a list of bullet points. So here it says each have different behaviors and simple AI, and then each bullet point tells me about the behaviors and simple AI of one of the followers, right? Don't just randomly go into bullet points when you don't have any reason to. The bullet points have a particular logic to them, and all the things in a list of bullet points should be in the same category. I've also put other follower types might be developed at a later date, but this list is considered the MVP, minimum viable product version for the base game. So I'm already delimiting what I'm trying to build at the moment. And instead of making the 200-page version of this document, where I spend days and days imagining all the variations of upgrades and units and stuff that I could do, which would be a good exercise to do later on, because this is a document that is kind of saying, here's what we're going to make at a prototype level, I'm not putting that detail in. I'm leaving it out and I'm pointing to a gap for me to come back later and fill it in. So many people just make too much of their game before they've tested it and checked it's fun. And this is why, like I've said a lot of times on this channel, I'm encouraging you to build a prototype, get it in front of people, test it, and don't make more than a level's worth of content. Don't make more than half an hour's worth of gameplay until your game has been tested by 10 or 20 people. That testing process will show you what parts of your core idea are worth continuing with and which parts need to be thrown away or changed radically. And that is the reason why I would recommend not making those big reams of descriptions of all the content and all the levels and all the story until you're at that point where you feel like those central game mechanics, those central systems has been thoroughly tested and works. I've also put here, as the player gains faith and followers, they'll be able to access and improve a tech tree similar to the divine inspiration tree in Cult of the Lamb. Again, directly referencing games that this is like. Here they'll be able to improve the passive attributes of different follower types and augment their skills and abilities. This is kind of a good approach, I think. I've explained what the value of this feature is. This provides strategic choices, making gameplay feel different each time, while also increasing the religious theme by tying these tech tree choices into concepts like the development over time of religious doctrine. That's quite a wordy sentence, but I'm basically saying, here is why this system is in the game. Here's why it's in the game from a gameplay point of view, and here's how it fits with the theme. And we're always trying to marry the theme and the mechanics as game designers. Every time there's a believable excuse for something being in your game, it's easier for people to understand. If we have a tech tree, but we call it something like the religious dogma development tree, whatever, then it explains that mechanic, explains that system in a way that fits into the world and will make it make sense to players. As you're outlining your core gameplay, maybe think about how you justify some of it. Don't just describe what will happen in the game. If you can come up with reasons why, then include that as well. Just remember that part of the exercise here is being concise and saying as much as you can in as few words as possible, because that is one of the core, most important skills that a game designer can have. I've listed the controls. These are obviously subject to change with prototyping, but at least I've thought it through. You know, if this project got a bit further on, I might pad this out with diagrams and things to make it visual. Again, respect your reader's time by making your document easy to digest. One of the reasons why I do things like break off into a table here is because someone who is looking at this who initially doesn't want to read it, right? Like a programmer or an artist or whoever, maybe someone like a publisher to fund a game. The more you break up the content and make it appeal to a bunch of different brain styles, people who are more visual, people who prefer tables and diagrams, the easier it's going to be for other people to get on board with your idea, because they'll find your document easier to digest. Making game design documents is very similar to making learning materials. You need to appeal to different learning styles. You need to make sure that there are some images in there. As long as those images aren't misleading, as long as those images help to explain the points you're making, then put imagery into your document. You know, and just to show you a quick example, one of the famous old 90s GDDs, that's actually more of a pitch than a GDD, but look at this from Diablo in 1994. It's filled with all these little bits of royalty-free medieval artwork that really kind of set the tone for the game, and even things like these headings are in a kind of slightly medieval gravestone font. It's a legible font, but it does add flavor to the document, and that's the thing that you can think about doing as you are working on your game design documents, is start to think about the graphic design of the project, start to think about your typographic choices and incorporate them into the document. You don't need to go wild with it, but it will start to make you kind of think about these elements of your game and the visual branding of your game. I've got a bit here about balance, right? Again, it's just outlining the broad approach. I don't go into a massive Excel sheet with all the balancing on at this stage, because I know I can do that. I've done it before and it will be its own document. But at this stage we just talk about what are the key things to think about. Now, in a multiplayer versus game, balancing is important to make sure people don't feel like they're getting bullied by other players. So I've put here, because the game is a survival king of the hill game, one player can get really, really powerful and just smush everyone. So it might be worth having some elements to prevent players getting too far ahead, right? I've put there should be some elements which prevent players getting too far ahead, and I've put one example of this could be culling areas of the map at certain times. You get a countdown every 30 seconds, there's a firestorm here, there's a flood here, and obviously the larger your following is, the more little characters that are following you around, the more of them will get taken out by that. Now, this is an important thing to pay attention to when you're doing any kind of technical writing, is words like should, could, will, that infer different levels of intention, right? So here I've put there should be some elements which prevent players getting too far ahead. That's not as strong as saying there will be. Then afterwards I've got one example of this could be culling areas of the map. So could is a less certain word than should. I know this might sound super obvious to you, but this is a technical document, and in order to describe things clearly and objectively, you need to be careful with how you use words like will, should, and could, and the degree of promise that exists in those different words. So this section is an example of that moving from general to specific that I talked about earlier. There should be some elements which prevent players getting too far ahead, right? That's general, and it's reasonably committant to the idea of having a balanced game where players can't get too far ahead of everyone else. And then one example of this could be doing this is moving to a more specific solution, but it's not presenting it as the only solution of like, this is definitely what we'll do. Okay, that's all I've got in my balance and pacing area. Whatever game you're making, it's going to be a different sort of thing depending on what genre of game it is, but it's an important area to talk about and at least have that initial thinking through of what your approach is for this game, because all of these sections are about that. They're about just kind of loosely saying, here's what our approach is going to be to this thing. And particularly if you're working in a team, that's the most important thing you can define at the beginning of the project, is not loads of detail about every individual part, it's more the approaches. The next section that I have here is character designs. Now, remember, unless you are an artist who is also the game designer, then art is not game design, but it does overlap with game design whenever it sort of influences the gameplay in some way. So that's what I've focused on in this section. The art style of the game needs to be simple and easy to read, right? There's a functional aspect of this art where if these characters don't look a particular way, players won't be able to play as well. Given that this is a god game in which the player characters are meant to see humans just as a tool for their own power, the human characters need to be small and to appear somewhat insignificant, right? This is like a generic convention of god games. We don't have players with a big face and a name who we kind of know who they are, not players, characters. It's part of the god game genre that they should look like ants. That's kind of part of the fantasy. I've put some examples from Age of Empires and Populous. Age of Empires not really a god game, but that's similar to the design I'm thinking about. No more detailed than this. The units in Prophecy should be small, and the visual style needs to support the following elements of the game design. And then we've got bullet points because we've got a list of things within the same category. They should be visually distinct enough to have classes like Forager, Farmer, Hunter. The units need to have team color clothes, as this will be a multiplayer game with lots of players. So like a lot of these older RTS and God games had, we need to be able to see which player they belong to by having some color coded clothing. And the characters need to look human enough to care about, but abstract and small enough to not care too much about. It's quite a difficult brief for an artist, but you can see this again. This isn't a detailed breakdown of everything about the character designs. It's just loosely defining, here's what's important to the game design about how the characters in this game might look. The visual style of the game can be 2D or 3D, but needs to allow for the above gameplay considerations. I don't even care if it's 2D or 3D. This is what I care about. This is the stuff that impacts the gameplay more. Setting and world. Right. Remember earlier I talked about using the game design document to limit the project so that you don't make too much too early. That's what I'm doing here. So the game will aim to eventually have a procedurally generated world which changes with each new game. However, and this is a big however, right? The prototype and vertical slice versions of the game should aim to have one persistent world with set locations for biomes, resources, etc. For speed of production, this world would simply have the layout of the real planet Earth, with the goal being to prototype using real-world land masses and then switch to a more procedurally led or customized world later on. If you are making a game with procedural generation in it, like a roguelike platform or any kind of roguelike, I would always recommend that you do this, because you will fall into this pit of just spending ages on your generation algorithms before you even know if there's a game there. So in this, I'm basically suggesting, well, I'm taking that one further, right? I'm not saying let's not procedurally generate it. I'm saying let's not even design it. Let's just copy the real world. There's a map. We've got a map already. Now I might have to build the what was it called, the Arctic shelf that went between North America and Europe to make sure it all joins up and you can get across the map. But I think that would basically cut out some production time and allow us to focus on designing the core gameplay rather than spending a lot of time thinking about level design and procedural generation and any of that stuff before we know that the game we're designing is a good game, right? Tone and aesthetics. Again, this might be something that needs its own document. We usually make like an art style guide or an art bible which collects mood boards and references and stuff. I'm trying to put everything in one document here to keep with this minimalistic approach. So I've just put some small bits of inspiration here. We had our character designs from our other games, and now I'm starting to bring in, okay, here are some movies I've seen that I think this game should evoke. So I've got the historic epic, I've got the Charlton Heston movie where he plays Moses here in the Ten Commandments, and you can already see that these movies have a very specific color palette that I could imagine this game using. And then over here I've got retro grim dark fantasy, so I've got a Conan and I've got whatever this is, and you can already see that there are some kind of color palette choices here that give this kind of classic cinema look, and I've picked them out as a swatch up here. And this is a gameplay relevant thing, whether you think it is or not, because making a game where there are potentially 12 or 20 different players on the map with different player characters, like a group of yellow characters here, a group of green characters, we really need those player character colors to pop out, and having a quite dark, neutrally toned world for that will actually help with the visibility of the overall game. So this isn't just a cosmetic thing, and it's not me like dictating to the artist, oh, the game has to look like these movies. It's more using them as a reference point to help us generate certain things like what the characters are wearing, what the colors of the backgrounds are, all of that kind of stuff. So there is a reason for doing this, even if it's not explicitly game design. Now, I've cheated here because the type of game that I'm talking about means I can have a narrative section that just says, not doing one, mate. Because this does not have any explicit narrative. When I say explicit here, I mean overt. There's no story being told in the game except what the players do. The game should provide memorable moments for emergent storytelling, but besides some tutorial text, we do not intend to have dialogue or characters speaking. Now, if you are making a very heavily narrative-driven game, you're going to have a bigger narrative section, and it's going to have subsections, and it might even be better to have its own document. But if you need to do that, then think about the principles I told you about earlier. Start with the broad, start with the general, move on to the specific, right? So your narrative design document needs to start with the broad stuff about the story and not get into specific events until it's defined the story in a loose way. Right, that's why we have things like the 3-act structures. You can talk about what happens in these different thirds of the story in quite general terms without listing every scene, right? And then as you move through that document, you get to more specific things like listing characters, listing locations, listing scenes. But you always start with the general and then move to the specific. And then lastly, another one of these things that indie game developers seem to have to, and lastly, another one of these things that indie game developers seem to hate doing, and that's having a business model. And now, this is not necessarily a good business model, but it's at least workable. It's something that I've thought about, and it seems like in a kind of 30-second blah 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 whatever, it seems like it might work for this game. Okay, this is a premium game which users will purchase once and then own for good. That's what most indie games are. But it's an online only game, and those are heavily dependent on larger user bases. If you don't have enough players playing, I don't know, Among Us or any kind of heavily online game, you have to do bots and you have to do different approaches. You have to add single player modes. So we have to have a business model that accounts for this and gets enough players into the game in the first place. So I've put this 3-step thing. 1, an initial limited features free demo release to gain initial interest and traction, right? So give the game away for free first, but missing a bunch of stuff. It's like the old shareware model. Then secondly, a Kickstarter campaign to raise funds to develop all features and content which are beyond the scope of this initial design document, right? So you let people play the game, you say, this is fun, isn't it? Wouldn't it be better if you could put a little hat on your profit? Wouldn't it be better if your profit could set themselves on fire? Wouldn't it be better if you could smite people with giant eagles or something like that? And then that becomes the basis for the Kickstarter. People have already played the game, they like it, hopefully, and then they become Kickstarter backers because they've seen the game and they want to see it grow. And then lastly, a full premium release in the under $10 category with Kickstarter backers receiving Steam keys plus whatever in-game rewards have been arranged, right? They might want to design their own emblems that people can have on their banners in the game. I don't know, whatever. Again, that's too specific for the purpose of this document. As the full version of the game will include tech trees and some carryover features, so you play a session of the game, you die after 15 minutes or 5 minutes or 45 minutes, you keep some upgrades or some cosmetic items between games, kind of like rounds in Hades. It will be relatively simple to craft an appealing set of Kickstarter rewards up to and including backer design elements. And this is not a video about Kickstarter, but remember what I said earlier about your game will have an audience. It will have an audience, small or big, whatever that audience is. So you may as well work out what it is from day one, or start to think about it at least. The same is true of your business model, of your funding model, how you get money. And if Kickstarter is part of that, if something like asking for donations to build the game is part of that, then you need to build rewards, and that means that you need a game where digital rewards where players can put something in the game or whatever are easy to add in, right? So it's all tied together, and I think overall what you need to understand about the purpose of a game design document, or there are lots of benefits to creating one, but one of the big benefits is to force you to think through the areas of the game that you are not naturally drawn to, right? And whatever section I've put on here that is for you, it might be this stuff of like thinking about how to make the characters stand out in the game world. It might be the controls, whatever it is, going through all the aspects of the game in this systematic way and just writing a simple paragraph or making a table about each of them, just as a starter exercise, is really helpful, because there will be an area of game design that you personally try to run away from and avoid. And that's why I'm saying, like, it's not about finding which area of the game you find the most interesting and writing 100 pages about it. It's about thoroughly covering every aspect of the game in a small section initially. And once you've got all that, you can then step back from it and you can see, does all this link together? Does it make sense that I've made this potentially offensive game and then aimed it at 5-year-olds? Oh yeah, maybe these parts don't work together, right? It's like a sketch initially of like loosely, here's all the parts, do they look right together, kind of compose them, move them around. And if you want a list of these sections, I'll put them in the timestamps for this video, so you've got easy access for if you want to do your own. But this is kind of the most stripped down approach to game design documents I think you can do. And naturally, if you get to a point where you are writing lots of narrative and working out different characters, or you're doing very numerical game design, like balancing lots of units or lots of items, that's when you need a spreadsheet or you need a different kind of document. And that is a game design document as well. But this is the top level minimalist, like simple first approach that you should do for pretty much any project. And I would say before this even, there's another approach of writing a one-pager, which is like a pitch, which is just a page long, one image, and here's what I want to make and here's why it will be successful. But this is kind of the first kind of game design document I would encourage you to make. Nothing more detailed than this until you know that the game is worth making. And you don't know that the game is worth making until you've got a prototype and people are playing it and saying, yeah, I'd play that again. And they're being honest and not just lying to you because, I don't know, they're your mum and they're proud of their little game developer that they gave birth to. Here's my little plug for this episode. If you've watched all this and you found it helpful, but you're also thinking, oh, I still want someone else to do it for me, and you want someone to directly help you with your game design documents, then I now have a profile on Fiverr where you can hire me to do that. I've got a gig on here called I Will Review Your Game Design Document. And there are different kind of pricing levels in there. The most basic one is where I just read your document and I leave comments on the document and email it back to you. There are more enhanced ones where you can have a call with me and I can take you through the main issues, whether it's with the documentation itself or what I think about the actual design you're proposing. That's kind of up to you, but have a look on there if that interests you. I might be able to help you or your studio out. And it's a relatively small price tag for something that might cost a bit more if I was doing it for a big studio. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope I haven't upset anyone too much because you've already made a 5,000 word game design document and you feel like I've just undermined your approach. That's not what this is about. This is about trying to give you the kind of minimalist approach that gets you to the point of making the game you should be making as quickly as possible. And sometimes the only way to learn that is to plan a game very quickly, make the game, and then fail and realize that you need to make something else, right? That's just part of any creative or technical thing. But taking this approach where your game design documents are initially quite minimalistic helps you to do that process of comparing all the parts and making sure they fit together before you go into lots of detail. I'm also a big believer in treating a game design document as a working document and basically leaving it open to change. And also not necessarily treating the whole project as one document. Now, these are all things that are going to change for you depending on the type of project you're making. But let's say, for example, you're making a game that has loads of information about different levels that needs to be stored in a document. It may be better for that to have its own separate document and for your game design document to be a series of documents in folders. So bear all that in mind. The larger the project, the more complex, the more reason there might be to break your game design documentation up into several different parts with different focuses. There's no hard and fast rule about how to do one of these. It's really about just making sure you've addressed all of the key design questions that you have before you go into full production for a game.